Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Nathalie's website, join the podcast's Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So welcome to the How to Deal with Grief and Trauma podcast. Today I've got Amanda Anderson here with me. And Amanda, I don't know, she was one of those guests that reaches out to me, and I got curious about her because first of all, she's a fellow Aussie and I like that already. And then I went to her website and I found out a couple of things which sort of piqued my interest. And so here we are today. I don't know much about Amanda. That's how I usually run this, that I actually want to be like you as the listener. I want to be fresh and new and ask those questions that come out of curiosity and interest. But this is what I know so far about Amanda. Amanda is the person who learned early how to hold together when falling apart wasn't an option, and then decided to tell the truth about what that cost. She speaks to the quiet resilience people live with every day, but rarely name, translating trauma, survival, and growth into language that feels uncomfortably accurate. Her work doesn't fix you. It gives you permission to stop pretending you were never hurt and choose what to do next. So welcome, Amanda, first of all. How are you today?
I'm fantastic. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and it is still summer, so it's nice and warm here. And I'm really happy to be part of this podcast.
So one of the things which I found out when just looking at your website is that, first of all, you wanted to come and live in Switzerland, which is where I am, but also a couple of parts of you. And interestingly, I found that you don't share too much detail about your personal story. A little bit, enough to see who you are and what you've went through. But as we start, let's share with the listener, or you share, how did grief and trauma become part of your life?
Well, so my first exposure to trauma and grief was when I was just shy of 10 years old, and I lost my brother to a violent incident. So it was a sudden passing, and I'm happy to talk about it, but I also don't want to re-trigger anyone. So feel free to ask any questions that you need to. But it started then, and I think, in my experience, and I'm happy for people to prove me wrong, but in my experience, when you tend to have trauma, you tend to have more trauma, and it continues on. There's some people in the world who just never experience anything and live their best life. And then there are other people who tend to have sort of a list of things. And I found that happened for me. So it started with my brother being killed, and then my sister was born with a terminal illness. So she passed from cystic fibrosis when she was 20 years old. She actually passed the day before my birthday, which is traumatic in itself. Yeah. Then my father also, he got leukemia and he ended up passing. So they're the sort of grief traumatic scenarios that I've had. I also have experienced 2 co-workers / friends who have taken their own lives, and I've experienced sexual assault within my family. I also had a stroke or a mini stroke, and have had other physical ailments like postnatal depression. I had a motorbike accident. So I've had some physical trauma as well, and I have ongoing daily, I wouldn't necessarily call it trauma, but it's difficult. It's adversity because I have 2 neurodivergent children who although they're high functioning, still come with, daily struggles. And so, yeah, I feel that I am well equipped to talk on your podcast about grief or trauma.
Well, definitely, just from the list that you've given, is sort of a bullet point list of that people would have in terms of their certification, but in terms of life experiences of many and also close to you, death related in the family. I mean, this is a lot just in the first couple of minutes that you've shared. How does that work for a nervous system, having to deal with that in an ongoing? I mean, you mentioned that before, that it's like, I don't expect that we have like that are magnetic for trauma, but how did your nervous system deal with that?
So I think that, when I was younger, because I was so young when my brother was killed, ultimately my parents role modeled how to cope with it. My father essentially shut down emotionally. He was still, a high functioning individual. No one would necessarily know that anything was wrong with him, but emotionally he was shut down. And my mother, she had, 3 other kids to deal with. And so she just got on with life. And so that's how I learnt to cope with grief, trauma, adversity of any kind. So I think what ends up happening is you get so used to pushing through that you actually don't notice that your nervous system is maxing out. And it was only as I, aged into it that I realized, hang on a minute, my cup is very full and it's starting to leak over a little bit. I need to make some changes.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a couple of things. First of all, the modeling that we get from the surroundings that we live in. We see how people deal with whatever we're given, and we're taking that in a younger case mostly on and repeat it. And then also the way that life shapes around it. Like when you say your cup was full and was over spilling. So take us through a little bit at a time from what you've learned from your parents coping with it, because obviously you lost a brother at 10 and that doesn't go unnoticed for a 10-year-old sibling. And also you mentioned murdered, but that whole thing, even if your parents push through, that leaves an imprint on you as well. So how did the 10-year-old Amanda, how did she deal with the fact that time with seeing, obviously the first instant would always leave shock on the family, on the parents as well. How did you, as a 10-year-old, deal with that?
Well, interestingly, back then in the 70s, there wasn't a framework for explaining these kinds of things to children. You didn't often send children to psychologists, etc. And so as a result, no one sat me down and told me that my brother had been killed. I heard it through conversations on the phone, my parents talking to each other, my mother crying, my dad switching off. So because I wasn't informed and sort of taken through that process, I determined for myself how I was going to deal with it. And that was to ultimately, at the age of 10, be the easy child, be low maintenance, stay out of the way, don't cause any trouble, don't need anything, be self-reliant, all of those kind of things. And that's what I did. And it worked amazingly because I did that for my whole life, But as I got older, I started to realize, that inadvertently I had these limiting beliefs that, feelings and vulnerability and needing were weakness when, that wasn't necessarily the case. But it's what I had learned growing up. I'd also learned that, the world wasn't safe. People weren't safe. So I certainly wasn't going to talk about how I felt or share my feelings or my experiences because that makes me vulnerable. And also, I can handle it. I handled it all before. I don't need any help. And, it sort of perpetuates its own cycle that way.
Mm-hmm. So how did you make the 180-degree switch? Because obviously now, if people go to your website, they find out that you're a keynote speaker and you talk about your experiences. You want to show up with what has happened and how you dealt with it. You talk about resilience. How did that, and let's go slow, because people at that point where they're in early grief or in the aftermath of a trauma, they cannot experience or even imagine where you are now. So let's go slow.
Okay. I think, so the first things, I mean, it does take time. There is no singular moment where you just flip a switch. There is, a self-awareness that has to be present. And I do a lot of that. My favorite pastime habit is to have a pen and a piece of paper and a cup of tea and a blanket and a fireplace. And I just write down all my thoughts and I'll ask myself questions. I'm feeling really angry today. Why are you angry? Well, because this happened. Okay. And what does that mean? And I'll just keep sort of almost giving myself a psychology session. And through that, I've learned about myself and I've learned who I am and how I feel, and I can recognize patterns. And so that level of self-awareness, I think, is one of the first steps for me anyway. I think after that, it is a level of self-care. You have to be kind to yourself because you're sort of purging the well, throughout that self-awareness piece. So self-care, sleep, all of the typical things, sleep, good food, don't push yourself too hard, those kind of things. But then I think the bit for me that sort of flipped that switch is the ability to reframe what has happened and to take it out of what happened to you versus what it means to you, what happened. So, for example, I know I didn't explain that very well. For example, when my father died, that absolutely gutted me. Even though I had had many other experiences in my life, there was something about my father passing that really tore me apart. And it took a while for me. I felt like my DNA was missing, and not just, physically, but I was his DNA. Now he wasn't walking on this earth. Who did that make me? So I really struggled with my identity, and I told my husband, when he passes, I will change. I know I will, because I am so in tune with who he was. And I spent a lot of time in the recent days after he passed. I couldn't sleep, so I'd get up and I would walk the neighborhood at 4:00 in the morning and just try and get out of my body and into the fresh air. And I would cry. I would sob the whole time that I walked. And I kept saying, who am I without him? Like, I was focused so much on what I had lost and so much on what I was missing. And then one day I sat there and I thought, instead of who am I without him, what about who am I because of him? So that reframe made me realize he was the happiest man I have ever met in my life. And I also had that. I had that ability, and I just looked at all of the things that he brought to my life, and it helped me take that on board and focus more on reframing what happened, that loss, and trying to find, that silver lining in even just having experienced it. It's like that saying, better to have loved and lost than to never loved at all. And I know that when you're grieving, you think bullshit, right? Like, no, I would rather have them here. I totally get that. I just think that at some point, in order to be able to move through that pain, that sort of switch has to very slowly occur. And that happened for me with my dad, but it didn't really happen for me with everything. So when you say to me, how did I become the person that I am now? There was actually a moment in time. So there was all that lead up, but then there was also a moment in time about 2 years ago. I was not happy. I had obviously, build up of all of this grief and all of this trauma. And although I was pushing through, I was still struggling. And I decided to take a holiday, but stay at home for the holiday. So I had no plans, no sightseeing. I could sleep all day and, do whatever I needed to just refill my bucket. And I was walking down the street. I do a thing called a gratitude walk, where I walk through my neighborhood and I look at everything that's amazing. And I'm like, oh my God, there's thousands of leaves and there's birds and there's a beautiful sky. And I have all this gratitude. And it just dawned on me. And I thought, because I was struggling with, where my place in life. And I realized a lot of people, they'll say to you, well, what would you do if you won the lottery? Like when they're talking about changing your life, it's, what would you do if you won the lotto? And I don't think that's a valid question because, what would I do? I'd travel the world. That's not necessarily going to change my life. And, 1 in 16 billion people win the lotto. It's not really something that is going to actually happen. But then it occurred to me, well, hang on, what if I got a phone call right now saying, hey, your blood test just came back, you've got a terminal illness, you've only got a few months to live. And it hit me and I thought, I'd be really pissed off. But not only because I had a terminal illness, because I sat there and I thought, I've wasted my life. I've spent my whole life bracing, preparing, protecting myself, watching, being hypervigilant so I could manage every situation and, keep myself safe from more trauma, that I actually wasn't living my life. And so that was a penny drop moment where I thought, do you know what? My purpose in this life is to no longer play small and no longer be palatable and no longer numb myself to all of the pain, because inadvertently I'm also numbing myself to all the joy. And so now it is about visibility. It is about vulnerability. It is about authentically, unapologetically being me. And if life decides that it's going to, jump on the bandwagon again and give me another trauma, well, that's okay because I have me and I know that I can get through it. I've done it before, and there's times where I've been lying crumpled on the floor in the fetal position, but, the next day the sun rises, I get up and I plod through and, before you know it, it does get a little bit better. So I have faith and trust in myself to get me through those things. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. And I'll pick out a couple of things for people listening to see, like when they're in the dump, like you described yourself, like obviously people then in their nervous system, they are in a place where there's very little activation and very little movement to actually be doing something, to feel nothing's going to change. Like, what is it worth? And I think one of the things that you mentioned in another circumstance is movement. And what I think it is important for people to hear that, and what I talk to clients about is like, even after a traumatic loss, if you're not able to get up, there is little movement that can happen, which maybe even is sitting up. I mean, in your case, you mentioned after your father died, you couldn't sleep and you went walking. I mean, walking is a really good way, bottom-up technique, somatically, to regulate the nervous system. And even if it's just because you can't sleep, but even a small thing to do, whether that is 10 minutes at the start, as a self-experiment, to just say, okay, I'm just going to put on my sneakers in the first day. And maybe I just walk around in my house, or then I go outside the door, and to just use it as a self-experiment, because it cannot go wrong, actually, as we know. And, at the beginning, for someone who's really in that place where nothing matters, there might be a person, and those people listening as well, supporting them, who can say, we don't need to speak, but let's just go for 5-minute walks around the neighborhood.
You know what else as well that reminds me is that there are days where I cannot get out of bed, right? And I think that it is a build-up of all of the traumas that I've had. And, I get to a point where my nervous system just says, no, we're not doing this today. On those days, I do one of two things. And the times when I can't get out of bed, it almost feels like chronic fatigue. Like just lifting my arm is like, this is too much effort. And on those days, I lie there and I think, I'm not going to get up. I'm not going to bother. I'm not going to worry about it. And it's okay to do that on occasion. So I think it's also about giving yourself permission to just lie there if that's the case, even if it's just for 3 hours, because eventually you will, have the energy to get up. The other thing that I do, if I can get out of bed, is that I will get up and I'll just open I have a balcony door, so I'll open the balcony door and then I'll go and get back into bed. But the fresh air, the sound of the birds, the trees moving, those kinds of things, I look out at the world instead of getting stuck inside myself. And that also helps. So I'm not discounting movement. I do it all the time. I go outside, I lie on the grass and I ground. I do lots of those things. But I'm just saying, for those people who, a walk is too far, sort of a jump, those are the other things that I also allow myself to do when I need to.
And to put some nervous system language onto that, what you were just saying is that the nervous system is in the state that is most suitable for where it feels you are at the moment. So it's always there to look out for your safety. So if you're listening and you might feel like Amanda, that you can't get out of bed, that is because your nervous system is in what's called the dorsal vagal state. And that's where it needs to be. And what we're thinking, I shouldn't be, is only because we've learned that we shouldn't be lazy or wasting time or whatever the belief is that goes along with that.
100%.
But the nervous system might need that. And it's transient because we're moving through these states on a daily basis, hundreds of times. So we're not going to stay in dorsal all the time. We're going to eventually go to the bathroom, for example, which needs a bit of energy, which needs a bit of activation, which is fine. Or we get a drink of water or whatever. And as you were just saying that in terms of opening the window and hearing the bird songs is a really positive cue for the nervous system, because birds only sing when they're safe.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So obviously if it's cold winter and they're not here, they won't be singing, but we have just had winter and the birds are singing too. Some birds remain here. So that's a cue to the nervous system, their safety. And these cues, your nervous system is always scanning the environment for cues of safety and danger. So it's a really good way to say, okay, let my body get some cues of safety, because that helps the regulation. On another side, if we were to strip away the speaker or the keynote talker, the strategist or the model creator, can you take us into a private moment when you were most unlike maybe the battle-tested woman that you are today, that people see when you're on stage? Mm-hmm. What would that have looked like? One of those private moments that people usually don't share.
Oh, I'm happy to share. I tend to be, so I do one of two things when I'm not in a good place. One is my bed. Like, I'm definitely a sleeper and mostly a sleeper. I sleep when I'm really not in a good place. Mm-hmm. And I give myself permission to sleep all day. If it takes 3 days, well, then it takes 3 days. But the other thing that I do is I cry in the shower. I sit on the floor and I just sob my little heart out. And actually, that reminds me, there's two versions. There's the sad version where I will sit in the shower and I'll just let the tears run. And I actually think it's really helpful, because for someone who previously didn't think it was okay to have feelings and to have tears, you don't feel them in the shower. So you don't, it's almost like a subconscious trick that you don't realize how much you're actually crying when you're crying in the shower. So that's one thing I do. And then the other thing I do is I actually have a lot of rage inside me. So my persona 99% of the time is very chill. I've got no problems. My line is quite far back. But I know internally that I have, a very, what could be a short wick. Things can frustrate me. Stupid things will frustrate me really, really quickly. And what I do is a thing called rage journaling, which I absolutely love and recommend. And what it is, you get a pen and a piece of paper and you don't even look at it. You can close your eyes. It doesn't have to be written in lines. It can just be scribbled across the page. It doesn't matter. And I will write anything that comes out. And I'll always say thank you first, because I don't want to put negative stuff into the universe. So I'll say, thank you for that woman who walked in front of my car today, exclamation, exclamation, or thank you for the fact that I made a tea and then completely forgot about it and it sat there for 15 hours, or, whatever it is. And it will go from the tiny things that I don't even register in my conscious mind on a day-to-day basis to the bigger things where I'm like, thanks for all the crap that I have had to put up with in my life, and, all of that kind of stuff. And I'll underline it and I'll swear and I'll, whatever it is. And the funny thing is that I completely release all of it. I completely purge all of it in that moment. Doesn't mean that I've purged it for the next month. It just means in that day, it may have taken me 5 minutes. It may have taken me 20. Sometimes it's one small scribble. Other times it's pages. I have to keep going because I'm now getting black all over my hand from the ink. But it really helps me get it out of my body. And I think that's one of the things that when you have had trauma and you have grown up sort of keeping it all together, I remember I had a moment where I realized at 50, I was like, oh my God, I've been holding my breath my whole entire life, literally holding my breath, bracing and waiting and just like this. And so I think for me, crying in the shower is a release when I'm sad, and rage journaling is a release when I'm angry. And anything above and beyond that, like overwhelm, I just sleep.
So you just gave us a couple of ways that you're dealing also with emotions. If we were to go into your body where grief still lives today, as we know, it's a part of us.
Yep, it's in my diaphragm.
And how do you practically tend to that place you feel if you feel an old wound being touched?
So previously, when dealing with an old wound, I would, be strong. I would fight it. I'd be like, life is hard, but I'm harder, and all of that kind of battle warrior element. Now I don't do that. Now I say, well, and I feel it. Like it's there now. I know it's there. It's in my diaphragm. I carry it in my body. And when it's really triggered, I try to say to myself, do you know what? Like, it's okay. Like, it's okay to be broken. It's okay to be hurt or have loss or feel betrayed, And I think the difference is that now I lean into it. I feel it fully. I allow myself to go there because I trust that I will be able to pull myself back out with it. So do you know what I mean? So I'm fully present with it in an honest and real way, because I know that in the long run I will learn and I will grow and I will come out the other side. And yes, I will be changed, but I will still be intact. And so I kind of embrace it, I guess.
So leaning in and embracing it, is that more something that you do from thinking about it or from a body, from a sensation?
From a body. I think what's happened is in my past, my body automatically tensed up and I automatically went into battle and I automatically held my breath and braced.
Yeah,
and
because also
protected.
You mentioned these sentences like I have to. There's a lot of cognitive based beliefs that made your body obviously then like top down say, okay, I have to brace and breathe shallow. So now what's the leaning in and embracing it? How does that work in the body?
I can see in my mind's eye, or I can feel that circle in my diaphragm that is black, like a black mist. And what's happened is, over time, it started cognitively, where I recognized the patterns and I self-cared and I, went through the processes. But I've been doing it long enough now cognitively that I can stop that thinking process and just go, okay, let's just feel this. Let's feel how it feels to have that uncomfortable feeling, and allowing myself to, you know what it is? It's psychological safety. It's trusting that I can allow myself to feel those feelings because I'll come through it. So I don't know. This is a very good question. Trying to think of my answer. I don't know how I lean into it other than to allow it. I let it be, whatever it is, and I give it room. And if it means that I feel overwhelmed, I don't try and stop feeling overwhelmed. I just say, oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed. And I ride it out, I guess, and wait till I don't feel overwhelmed anymore. Yeah, I don't know.
No. You said the exact words that I understand. Or let me put other words around it for maybe for you as well to hear it. Well, basically what you said is, you mentioned the words leaning in and embracing, and what you physically experienced. Also, you mentioned the psychological safety, and also the new word that I would give you, sort of turn towards. In most cases, people have learned that, what can I do to not feel or think that, to sort
100%.
of push it away or dismiss it or minimize it or fault finding someone else. But what you described, you tell me if but you sort of turn towards it. And when you say psychological safety, it's also, or what I heard you speak about, is like self-compassion, to say, well, this is it. And knowing from previous experience, everything is transient. And you said you had the safety to know this will pass.
And it's self-trust. I know, I've made it through my worst days already. So I can make it through my next worst days if that's, what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think for people listening to this, it's small things that add up. And as you were saying, it needs time. But in this time, you did a lot of different things, a lot of experiments, even that, let's say, the writing or the shower. And I think it's not a matter of ways that everyone should do it, but as a practice of experimenting with what works for me.
Yeah, and I actually do a lot. I do grounding. I do vagus nerve massage. I meditate. I do gratitude walks and affirmations. I sit in the shower and just, sit there. I do a lot of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. I do a lot of reframing, and I look at my limiting beliefs and, my perspective on things. So I actually that's one thing that I do. And it's interesting that you sort of picked up on that. I don't think that there's a one size that fits all solution to anything. I think what we have to do is try it out, see how it feels. If it works, brilliant. Keep that on the list. And if it doesn't, fine, it moves on. And I think that's why when I did the rage journaling, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Because for me, it made me realize I'm actually quite rageful. So, I didn't know that before, but I had a lot to say. Yeah. And so that particular thing worked for me. But I've done it with people before and they're like, yeah, like it was okay. But that's okay. It means that something else might work for them. So my recommendation, as you said, is try it all, but try it, one at a time so you can see, okay, did this work? Did it make me feel better? Yes, no, 3 bags full, next one. And, and then you get sort of a repository of options available to you. And then when you are in a moment where you're triggered or struggling, you can try those options and see, okay, well, that made me feel 5% better. Maybe I'll do the other thing as well, and that will make me feel 10% better. And you work through it.
When you were speaking, I just had I often have a lot of visualization of metaphors that maybe symbolize that. And what I saw was a lot of those tools that you mentioned, or the techniques or the strategies or whatever, the NLP, which, as you might know, I'm also familiar with, is that different, let's say, whether they're trauma, grief, or whatever other challenges we face in life, the picture that I had is like doors. And not every door requires the same key. And not every door works with the same key next time. So it's like having a bundle of keys, and some of those keys are bottom up, sort of from the body up to the mind, and some are top down. They're more like cognitive strategies. And I was just seeing this ring of keys like they have when they sort of have a big house with many, many doors and different keys, and you have to try. And sort of you get an idea, these keys usually work well with this kind of door. And sometimes you need to open bottom up from the body, do a walking, do a breathing to just be with it or turn towards. And sometimes it's a way to think about it that might help.
Yeah, the more you try, the more self-awareness you get. And so you can move to the next step.
And then you know your doors and you know your keys. Yeah.
That's it.
Interesting. I have already a couple more thoughts and ideas that this is always inspiring for me to talk to people that bring me sort of these new things. To bring this to around today, let me ask you this question. So if your younger self, the one that was in the thick of trauma or grief, you choose, if she could sit with us here in this conversation, and she could ask you one unfiltered question, and I'm interested in the question, and I'm also interested to hear what do you think she would ask, and how would you answer her now? I like your face. It tells me, so just to speak to those who don't see you, that's a good question. I have to think about it.
I'm like, well, I'm thinking crap. Okay. So what is the question that my younger self would ask me, and then what is my answer?
Mm-hmm.
The question would be, how am I going to get through all of this? Like how, there's so much coming. How could anyone possibly manage and get through in one piece? And I think that my answer is, what is my answer? My answer is, being on the other side of all of that trauma now, I can say, and I hope that this doesn't upset anybody, but ultimately everything that's happened to me shaped who I am. It made me, it built my character, and it built my personality. And because of that, although I can be vulnerable, I am also quite formidable. And, two truths can exist at once. And I am a whole human being because of what I have suffered. And so it's actually a plus. I know exactly who I am, and I know who I am not. And it's all because of the trauma and the loss. So I think, if my younger child said, how am I going to get through all of this? I'd say, because that in the end, it will help you be who you're meant to be. It will help you grow. You will learn from it. You'll learn so much about yourself that life will then happen for you. That's not the right way to say it, but yeah, it's basically, you're going to grow from this, and it'll make you who you become. And then, it's worth it in the end because of who you become.
Mm. What of your answer would your younger self be able to take? And which part of your answer would you say, I don't believe this is ever going to happen.
Absolutely. Oh, I think that when I was in it, when I was in the thick of it, I would absolutely think there is no positive here. There is no plus. I don't care, why can't I be the person that I want to be without all the trauma, And if I didn't have all the trauma, I wouldn't be so focused on dealing with all the rubbish. I would actually be able to be the person that I want to be. Without the trauma, you don't have the same perspective. Yes, you might be able to be whoever you want to be, but you just don't have the same depth of understanding. You don't have, I'm thinking about my own kids now, right? So you have generational trauma, and it usually gets talked about as something that harms the next generation. But I actually see the other side as well. So my trauma has shown my kids what's important. It's shown them that life is not always smooth sailing, but they can get through the hard times, and I think at 14 and at 16, they know themselves better than most kids their age, and they've suffered, but they've also now got a deep sense of who they are and what they're capable of. And that's the thing. I think that understanding of who you are and who you're not and what you're capable of, and that resilience, it doesn't happen without the suffering, not to the same extent anyway.
And not that we would wish our children to have the suffering, but the suffering isn't a choice. It's not something we choose, or the trauma or the grief. It just happens. So I think this is really beautiful what you mentioned, because it shows the perspective of the person in it, and it shows hindsight, what we have, or perspective, what we have later. Whatever the years, it's not a matter of time. It's a matter of the perspective that will be there at some point, and at any point a little bit different.
And that's the thing. I think no one is me. No one has lived my losses or felt my hurt or thought through the mess the same way that I have. And trauma gave me the gift of knowing who I am and how I think and how I feel. And I see that as a superpower now.
So thank you so much, Amanda. This has been fascinating for me to hear and to speak with you, also because we're speaking a lot of the same language from the background in NLP and trauma, grief. And for those people who want to hear more from Amanda, there is a wealth of knowledge on her website, also YouTube and other places, which we'll link in the show notes as always. If there was one last thing that you would want people to leave with, what would that be? For those who listen here, who mostly are dealing with something immediate now, some loss, some trauma.
You don't have to be as strong as you think you have to be.
I think that's a perfect place to end with this. Thank you so much, Amanda.
No, thank you. I appreciate your time and energy in this podcast.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nathaliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.